Welcome to the 15th episode of Deadville Sundays. We're back after the half-term holidays and hope you've all had as good a festive period as can be expected. Of course, such festive cheer cannot be expected to continue for too long, and so this episode will be focusing on the recent executions in the United States in the final days of Trump's dying presidency. To philosophize this, we will be using Michel Foucault's work Discipline and Punish. No prizes for guessing that one. Given this week's theme of power and the state, we will be arguing that this recent execution spree represents an exercise of inherent state power, and that such an exercise points to the inevitably dangerous capacity of the governments who wield this power. In sum, whilst Trump is to blame for this killing spree, he is only drawing upon the very capabilities that are invested in his office, and therefore, in the government. Trump, then, is just a very orange tip of a very dangerous iceberg. Reuters has reported that the US government was set to carry out the 13th and final federal execution under President Donald Trump's administration on Friday evening, just 5 days before President-elect Joe Biden takes office, with a promise to try to end the death penalty. End quote. Given the USA's notorious reputation for capital punishment, one would perhaps expect this number to be higher. However, the statistics, when set in context of the last 60 years or so, makes for difficult reading. Higgs, the surname of the man who will be the last execution of the Trump administration, is set to be the 13th person executed by the US government in an extraordinary spree began last summer by Trump, a Republican and avowed advocate of capital punishment, after a 17-year hiatus at the federal level. Prior to Trump, the federal government had executed only 3 people since 1963. End quote. Trump, then, has executed 4 times more people in his term than have been executed in the last 50-odd years. Regardless of where you sit on the capital punishment debate, what is undeniable is that the topic of lethal state power is very much back on the table. Now, given that Biden is set to freeze executions when he assumes the presidency, this change in policy will mark a change not only in the way that punishment is seen, but in the way it's actually used. This is something that Foucault notes in his work Discipline and Punishment. He remarks that by the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, the gloomy festival of punishment was dying out, though here and there it flickered momentarily into life. End quote. This gloomy festival, then, is rearing its ugly head again, in the same flickering manner as Foucault observes. Foucault presents punishment as being a spectacle, as being part and parcel of public life. For Foucault, punishment in the centuries preceding and including the 18th, as well as into the 19th, it was a ceremony that the populace and sovereign alike engaged in. However, this was not to continue to be the case, as there was a change in the mode of punishment which marked the disappearance of punishment as a spectacle. End quote. But this change in mode for Foucault was also due to the change in the class of crimes committed over time. As, in fact, the shift from a criminality of blood to a criminality of fraud forms part of a whole complex mechanism, embracing the development of production, the increase of wealth, a higher juridical and moral value placed on property relations, stricter methods of surveillance, a tighter partitioning of the population, more efficient techniques of locating and obtaining information. The shift in illegal practices is correlative with an extension and a refinement of punitive practices. End quote. Thus, the state, for Foucault, was almost certainly responding to a change in the type of things being committed. He notes further that what was emerging, no doubt, was not so much a new respect for the humanity of the condemned — torture was still frequent in the execution of even minor criminals — as a tendency towards a more finely tuned justice, towards a closer penal mapping of the social body. End quote. There was, for him, a greater respect being given to the body, but that led to a change of the mode of punishment of this newly respected body. Here, then, there is the rise of surveillance, the diffusion of the modern police force so that citizens would come to police themselves because they acted as if they were constantly on the verge of being caught. This is where Foucault has drawn heavily on Bentham's idea of the panopticon, that is, the prison design, which enabled a central guard tower to be able to constantly observe every cell, but no prisoner could see any other, nor into the guard tower itself. Thus Foucault points to the rise of the surveillance state, albeit a less bloody one, overtly at least. However, we argue that Trump's recent commencement of executions points towards the perpetual violent capacity of the state, that these acts of blood are baked into its foundations. These are not an exercise of extraordinary powers, but rather an exercise of the ordinary. Couple that with the vast military spending of the US and a copious amount of police violence. Under Trump, the state's mask has simply slipped. He's not forced it to wear a new one. Trump might be an odious man who has likely committed a number of acts which a vast majority of people find to be abhorrent. But what he is not is extraordinary. What Trump is the raw version of every other leader. Biden will be no different despite his purported stay of new executions. But why? Why does Biden's reduction in state-sponsored violence against its own people on its own soil not make him totally different? Valid questions. The answer is why the punishment spectacle is stopping again. It's not because it's immoral. It's not because he's a better man. It is because, as Foucault argued, governments cease to use these violent actions because it's seen as a validation of the use of such violence in any and all circumstances. As Foucault remarks, it was in any case dangerous, in that it provided a support for a confrontation between the violence of the king and the violence of the people. It was as if the sovereign power did not see, in this emulation of atrocity, a challenge that it itself threw down and which might one day be taken up. Accustomed as it was to seeing blood flow, the people soon learnt that it could be revenged only with blood. End quote. The state is always dangerous. It has the capacity to turn on the citizen, and where it pauses bloody violence, it only does so for its own survival. This marks the end of the 15th episode of Deadful Sundays. We hope you enjoyed it, and that we'll see you again next week.